Hi, welcome to First Congregational United Church of Christ in Mount Vernon's 2020 Adult Education Series. These sessions we've been looking at a book called Remedial Christianity, What Every Believer Should Know About the Faith but Probably Doesn't. It's by Professor Paul Alan Laughlin. And for this session, it will help to have read chapter 5 in this book on sin and human nature in the Christian tradition, and that's pages 139 to 169. And just a reminder again that I'm summarizing the chapter and I'm explaining the concepts along the way in my own words. So, like I've said before, please don't blame Professor Laughlin for anything I say without reading his words and making sure they're his, not mine. Chapter 5 it notes that all religions focus on an ultimate reality and humanity's relationship with that reality in light of human predicaments that religion offers to resolve or help placate or lament or understand. And in my mind, I think of it as religion's focus equals God plus relationship, which then results in well-being. I'm not sure that's a good math equation, but our focus is about God and the relationship that we have with God in creation and in one another, aiming toward well-being. Religion is about a relationship with God in creation, and it helps us avoid and get out of life's messiness and have well-being. And traditional Christianity developed a very negative view of humanity and a most radical means of salvation to deal with it. And this is a post-Easter Christianity, the tradition of that. Genesis 1 claims that humans are an image of God. And the early tradition interpreted the image to refer to the soul, the intellect, the spirituality, creativity, free will, and or the capacity for communion with God. And basically, it's seen as what makes humans uniquely human and divinely connected. The later written God created human in the image of God idea from Genesis 1 is typically linked up to the earlier written Garden of Eden creation story in Genesis 2 and 3, where humanity actually is portrayed as taking the image of God as a part of the fall. Genesis 2 and 3 have this image of God that is very human-like. God strolls about, doesn't seem to know all, plus God seems to have either not planned the human situation at Eden very well or set it up so humanity would be tempted and disobedient. And from our perspective, the God in the story seems limited in power and nature and knowledge. Until recently, Christianity has typically seen the Adam and Eve story as a true depiction of humanity's loss of the image of its likeness to God and damage to its relationship with God. Again, this is post-Easter Christianity, and that tradition sees humanity created in a state of grace and then falling from grace by the acts of Adam and Eve and ending up in a state of sin. The grace plus the fall equals sin. And so what we need is sin plus grace now to get to salvation. Modern Western culture tends to have a relativistic view of evil. In other words, evil is defined by the context in which it's considered. And this makes evil a value judgment. To quote Paul's Simon, one man's ceiling is another man's floor. So nothing is inherently good or evil. Instead, our perspective defines which is which. For example, bombing people is evil if the other side does it, but bombing people is not necessarily evil when our side does it, if we can justify it somehow. Plato taught that there are only good absolutes and that there was no evil, only deviation or deprivation from the good absolutes. And an illustration of this teaching is a rocket moving toward the sun that gets hotter from the goodness of the heat, but a rocket moving away from the sun gets colder because it's deprived of a heat source, goodness, not because it's moving toward a cold or evil source. So I wonder, could somebody argue that space is a source of coldness, evil, that the rocket's moving toward? In other words, is it the absence of heat, good, or the presence of cold, evil? Judaism, ancient Judaism, attributed both good and bad to God. That's in the Bible. Satan in the Old Testament is an agent of God who tests and tempts humans. In Job, God gives permission to Satan to cause misery to Job. And ancient Judaism didn't think like we do in terms of or like we tend to, in terms of a devil, because they were strict monotheists. Christianity, though, has traditionally viewed evil as coming from a negative power, the devil, an agent of evil that opposes God. Zoroastrianism, he talks a little bit about that. It's likely this good versus evil idea came from Judaism's exposure to Zoroastrianism and its good God, bad God beliefs. And consequently, as the New Testament developed, God is depicted as good and loving, and the devil, or Satan, is depicted as bad and evil. And the devil as a bad power or deity is then retroactively superimposed into the Adam and Eve creation story in Genesis. The Adam and Eve story never claims to be a factual account. It's a myth, but has traditionally been seen as somehow real. We think that the devil is in the story as a snake, but he or she is not. We think that there is an apple in the story, but there isn't. We think the snake is evil, but it's not. It actually tells the truth. The serpent does. God, it seems, in that story, doesn't tell the truth, and that the humans do not die when they eat of the forbidden fruit, which God had warned them would happen. The word sin also does not occur in the Adam and Eve story. Indeed, if sin requires a culpable mind, there can't be sin, since at the time of the act of eating the fruit, neither Eve nor Adam had a clue as to right or wrong, since they didn't yet know good and evil. By eating the fruit that they were told not to eat, Adam and Eve in the story essentially become God-like images of God by obtaining knowledge of good and evil, or creation's powers of good and evil is a euphemism for sexual relations, which some scholars think it might be. With this knowledge, Adam and Eve seem to lack only immortality that God has. And from our perspective, it seems unfair, or it could seem unfair, for God to drastically punish Adam and Eve and all their relatives for all time, and the snake, and even the earth. Many other religions define the human predicament not as sin, but as ignorance in the story. The three religions that focus on sin, the Aramaic religions, Judaism and Islam's spin is that sin is a breaking of the covenant of God, or an offense against God, which can be atoned through repentance, reformation, or ritual. Sin is missing the mark. That's what the word derives from, missing the mark that God aims us at, and missing it through wrongful acts. And this seems to be how most folks actually view sin today. Sin is to commit an immoral act. Sin is a misdeed. Through the Apostle Paul and then later Augustine, Christianity goes on its own way, away from Judaism and Islam. There's seeing humanity in its most negative form. Sin for Paul and for Augustine is this universal condition. Sin is a condition that people have. We're all seen as sinful from birth. Bad acts are not the cause of sin, rather sin was the cause of the bad acts. And people were seen as, and are seen as, innately sinful, and they cannot act out of goodness, only out of badness, even if the results of the act are good. Works righteousness is an idea where humans endeavor to do good to gain God's favor, but they are those works are to no avail with respect to salvation, since Adam's fall tainted all of humanity forever. That's the tradition. But the early church didn't have this sinful nature idea, at least in the Gospels. Instead, it grows out of Paul's writing, and then it's solidified later by Augustine. And then Augustine adds the idea that the precise chink in humanity's armor is the fall's effect on human will. Our free will is simply to pick one kind of evil over the other. There were alternative ideas that don't get picked up in the tradition. They become heresies. Orthodoxy becomes Augustine's route. But Pelagius, around the end of the 4th century, in the 5th century, early 5th century, argued if God expects us through commandments to do good, then we must be able to do good. I like that. His famous saying, this quote is, "If I ought, I can." In other words, if I'm supposed to do it, I should be able to do it. If I ought, I can was the gist of his argument. And Pelagian Christianity was based on the notion that humanity has the power not to sin. Pelagius saw sin as a quality of our action, not a condition of our soul. He understood grace was bestowed as a matter of merit. So he did think works mattered. And similarly, Clement and Origen and Irenaeus thought that humans were meant for perfection. And Irenaeus even argued humans had the potential to grow into the image of God. And many today would probably agree with these heretical notions that humans can do good and become more and more godlike through their acts. And matter of fact, we assert that we can become Christ-like, and that Christ is in our hands and our feet and our voice. The author of the book, Paul Laughlin, wonders if the church rejected the Augustine ways and embraced the "you are a sinner" way because it afforded the church power. Unmediated grace keeps the church's doings at a minimum, because the church accepted and pushed the notion that humans are radically sinful. A radical doctrine of salvation from sin was needed. Someone special and heaven sent was needed to effect that salvation through an act of power, a powerful act. But this idea originated with Paul. It didn't originate with Jesus. Jesus taught that people could stop sinning and that loving with the whole being was possible. And liberal Christianity, progressive Christianity, tracks this idea that humans are worthy and capable of improvement and capable of being Christ's hands and feet and voice in the world. The author talks about hell and notes that hell seems to have come out of a later Zoroastrian influence on Judaism. The three-tier idea of hell and earth and heaven is questioned by liberal Christianity on two main grounds. One, it doesn't fit our scientific view of the universe. And another is the idea that a loving God could send anyone to eternal torment is very hard to conceive or believe. The tendency of many modern Christians is to not be concerned about hell as a real life after place and focus instead on positive things: love, justice, compassion, peace, etc. Well-being, things that aim towards well-being. The theological problem with disavowing innate, awful sinfulness is, one, it lessens the need for a divine redeemer to be sent to save us, and two, a moral teacher is all that was and needed to set us right. So, three, a spiritual guide would suffice. Liberal Christians will need, the author argues, to overhaul traditional doctrines to work within the confines of Christianity to make progressive Christianity work. That's a brief summary, as quick as I could, of chapter 5 on Remedial Christianity. I'm glad you joined me today. I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.